What's up, YouTube, and welcome to a new series called PS1 Publisher Spotlight. What I figured I would do is, since I get so many requests for PS1 coverage on my channel, it's really hard for me to show more of my PS1 collection just due to how long it would take to get through the library. So what I thought I would do is break up some of the interesting publishers on the system and go through the library that I have for those. In most cases, I don't have complete libraries by publisher, but for some of the smaller ones like this one, I'm pretty darn close. So I figured I would go ahead and cover this one. Today we're going to take a look at the publisher Jaleco, which is unfortunately no longer in existence, although some of their properties have now translated to a new developer called City Connection, which is named after a classic Jaleco arcade game. Jaleco is a pretty interesting PS1 publisher. They put out 15 or 16 titles depending on how you define it. We're going to take a look at 15 of those today in the video. And one thing that's very common about this is they brought over a lot of very niche Japanese titles. However, many of these they did not develop themselves. They were more of just a publishing house for other smaller developers or games that really didn't have a chance of selling over here. I don't really think they were one of the more popular publishers, with the exception of one of the titles we're going to look at in this video. But I do think that some of these games, really, when you stack it up, are some of the more interesting US PS1 titles, just because they really took a chance on some games that we probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go through these roughly in alphabetical order. The first one of these is actually probably the first timeline-wise as well that came out, because it's the only long box release that Jaleco put out. And this is a part of their long-running Bases Loaded series. This is actually, believe it or not, the 8th game in the Bases Loaded series. So this is Bases Loaded 96 Doubleheader. This game also came out on the Sega Saturn as a long box release as well, so you can get it on either system. This game is notable because it does not have a jewel case variant for the PS1, so apparently it didn't sell well enough to re-release it in jewel case form. However, if you are a long box hunter, there is this one, which is like the soft cardboard box, but there's also one with the ridged plastic box that you can get to that is a little bit more difficult to find, if you ask me. This one is not very notable. It's a very early baseball game, like I said, for the system. This one does have official players, but it does not have official teams. So you can see, like on the example here, Mark Grace, a real player that used to play for the Cubs in the 90s, but it just shows his team as Chicago. It does not say the Cubs. So overall, this game's not that special. It does take 6 memory card blocks to save, which is kind of a downside of some of the early sports games. But overall, the Bases Loaded series, although it had 8 titles in it, it died after this one. So that was kind of the end of the run for Jaleco. I think this one actually was developed by somebody else, although the earlier games in the Bases Loaded series were actual Jaleco developed titles. So we'll move on from there and start talking about the jewel case games that are the remainder of the library. First one of these is yet again another weird one. This is Brahma Force, The Assault on Belt Logger 9. With a title like that, it just rolls right off the tongue, right? That's what little Timmy and Billy are going to ask for when they go to KB Toys to get a game. Things like that are probably decisions of why these games didn't sell all that well. So this game was not developed by Jaleco either. This is developed by Genki, and you're going to see a couple Genki titles in this video. This is a early 3D mech action game, not really something I'm too into. But it does have its fans out there. I just think there's better mech titles on the PS1, especially even that we got in the US. So this isn't going to be anybody's first choice. But artwork, again, is kind of vague. I mean, you don't even see a mech on the cover, just a strange little space explosion type thing going on. So it's really hard to get a grasp for what this game was supposed to be all about from a sales point. The next one of these has kind of crude 3D art, but I do have a soft spot for this. This is Builder's Block, and this is actually a Taito-developed game, and I am a huge Taito fan, if you're unaware. And so it was actually the only Taito title that Jaleco took a chance and brought to the US on behalf of Taito. This is also known as the arcade game Landmaker, and it is a 3D, or not 3D, it's a action puzzle game, and very fun and addictive. You have to build, like, these giant stacks of builders, block towers, and then you basically knock them down to get combos and things like that. Nothing too outrageous. I mean, it's very arcadey because it was, like I said, originally an arcade game. But I'm very happy this game came to the US. I bought this game brand new, and I had a really hard time finding this when it got released. So I know there's not a whole lot of these out there. And again, with artwork like that, it's really hard to make a sales pitch for this game. So Jaleco, again, it was cool they took a chance on some of these more unique titles, but sometimes their marketing department probably really wasn't up to stuff. Next, we'll look at a game they released to capitalize on a popular trend. This is Dragon Seeds, and this is essentially their idea of bringing a Pokemon-type game to the PS1 to capitalize on the popularity of that series. As again, they did not develop this game either. This one, I'm trying to remember what the company was that developed this one originally, but regardless, it was not a Jaleco-developed title. This one also had kind of a weird, like, memory card swapping technique to get different dragons. So basically, depending on what save files you had on your memory cards, that would generate new dragons in the game. Kind of a spin on the Monster Rancher game that read CDs to develop monsters for that game. So kind of building that concept in a new direction. Nobody really speaks very highly of this game, and again, I don't think they sold a whole lot of these. You don't see it that often. So overall, it didn't really hit its target, but, again, got some niche sales just for being one of those games to kind of capitalize on the Pokemon craze of the late 90s. Next, we're going to talk about one of my favorites that they brought over. This is a very obtuse title. This is Irritating Stick. Very happy we got this game in the US. I'm a big fan of the arcade game The Irritating Maze on Neo Geo, and essentially this is an attempt to bring the same series to the home console. This game was released in Japan on several systems, so there's a N64 version of this game, as well as I think on one other system as well. Possibly Super Famicom had an earlier version of this. The best way to describe it is if you've ever played the childhood game Operation, the board game. Very similar concept. You have to keep your stick from touching the sides of the maze, or else it will get very irritating and it will zap you. Not literally, but the DualShock will shake pretty violently whenever you buzz against the walls. The Japanese version of this had a really colorful announcer that would also yell at you as you're playing to really throw you off off your game. Unfortunately, Jaleco did remove some of that for the US version. This game's also notable because it does support the mouse, so if you want a little bit more precise control, you can try using the mouse to guide yourself through the mazes. Overall, I really like this game. It's also based on a Japanese TV show, is my understanding, so I think there was even maybe a TV game show where contestants had to challenge themselves through electrified mazes and things like that. Fun stuff, and again, I don't know, who really would have bought this game. The title doesn't really sell itself by any means, but very happy we got this release as well in the US. That game was developed by, I believe, Soros, who put out some of the other Neo Geo titles, so that makes sense considering they did the Neo Geo release of the game as well. Next, we're going to look at yet another weird one. This is Juggernaut, and this one is a 3 CD monster. Don't get too excited. It's really a point-and-click adventure game, and it has a lot of FMV, and so that's why it takes so many discs. It's just for so many of the cutscenes and things like that are in the game. This game just, the visuals are pretty crude, and I think by the time it released here in 1999, it just was looking a little bit dated. I think this one took an extra long time to get released here after the Japanese release, so that's partly to blame for that. This one was developed by a small developer called Will. Don't really know a whole lot about them, but again, this game probably was pretty successful in Japan. I just don't think this sold very well here at all. The artwork, again, is just so bland and strange. It's really hard to get a grasp just from looking at this in the store what kind of game you're about to play, so I think that had to have hindered sales of it a little bit. Next, we're going to look at two more very niche titles that Jaleco brought us, and one of these I think is actually one of the rarities of the PS1. First one of these is K1 Revenge, and this is really like a mixed martial arts style from Japan that mixed all these different martial arts together. So you had karate, kenpo, kickboxing, and kung fu all melded together into a mixed martial arts style. The reason I say that this was very niche is that UFC hadn't really taken off in the US to the extent that it did a couple years after this release. And, while this probably could have piggybacked on the success of that, I just think these were a little bit too early. THQ actually put out the first K1 release in the US before this, but Jaleco picked up the torch for these other two releases I'm going to show you. Both of these also are not Jaleco developed titles. They were developed by a company in Japan called Daft, as well as the one that THQ published. So they were all part of the same series, and I think there were even more in Japan that we didn't get here. This one you don't see very often, but the next one I'm going to show you I think is incredibly rare. So we'll move on to that one. So this was the sequel from the last one I showed you, and this is K1 Grand Prix, and it has this, again, very strange artwork on the front that yells at you and says, "It kicks." Well, you know, it's a kickboxing game, so I would hope there would be some kicking involved with the fighting. Again, you know, this is just such a strange release to get released here. This one came out in the year 2000, so, you know, UFC had taken off probably by that point, but I don't think K1 ever made inroads in the US to the same extent. There must have been some fans of K1, because there is one or two K1 games on the PS2 as well, but I think even Konami was who published that one. So, you know, Jaleco, the end of the road was here, as far as their attempts to popularize the sport here. But this one, I actually took a look on eBay, because I just know that I got this one a few years ago for myself, but I don't see this game in the wild hardly ever. And I could only find one completed copy of this in complete condition that sold in the last 3 months. So take that for what it's worth, but I have a feeling this one has potential to go higher for PS1 collectors that are really trying to get some of the rarities for the system, because I just don't see this game too much. Let's move on and talk about some of the other Jaleco titles. So the next one is one that I really like. This one is Nectaris Military Madness, and if that second subtitle means something to you, it probably should, because if you are a TurboGrafx-16 fan, you probably know Military Madness very well. It was a very early hex-based grid strategy game that really took off well in the United States. I think a lot of people consider it among their favorite TurboGrafx games. Overall, a very Japanese game in nature, but for some reason, I guess just with the military theme, it hit well in the US also. And a lot of people, like I say, on the TurboGrafx really appreciate that game. This one was, I think, developed by Hudson Soft in Japan, just like the original was, and Jaleco brought it over, again, with a very bland cover. You know, again, very hard to tell exactly what kind of game this is from looking at it on the shelf. I also think that calling it by the name Nectaris, even though that was the name in Japan, may have been, you know, amiss, as the Military Madness branding probably meant a little bit more in the United States. Overall, it's a very good remake of the classic Military Madness or Nectaris games. There were a couple of those on the PC Engine in Japan, and I think this one is an enhanced version of that CD version for the PC Engine CD. I like this game. I think it has some nice little cutscenes in it, and overall maintains the classic gameplay style without mucking it up too much. So I think that, you know, if this is the kind of game that you like, the strategy games that are pretty simple to pick up and play, it's a good one to go for the PS1. I haven't looked at this one lately, but for a long time this game really wasn't going for a ton of money, even though I just don't see this one very often either. Next is one that has gotten a lot of recent publicity. I think this one flew under the radar for a really long time. This is Punky Skunk. It has this incredibly colorful cover. You know, again, I just don't know if this is what sold the game. Obviously, it didn't do too well because this game is pretty hard to find for the system. Why this game has become notable recently is that it is a 2D platformer for the PS1, which there are not a whole lot of in the US. But what was kind of unique about this one, especially when the game got reviewed initially, is that a lot of people complained that it looked like a Super Nintendo game. They're like, there's nothing about these graphics that look next-gen or PS1 quality. So while it played really solidly, there just wasn't a whole lot to move it forward as a next-gen type of game for an earlier PS1 release. What's come out of this game recently is that it was discovered a Super Famicom prototype for this game. So somebody recently unearthed a fully playable prototype, and it actually was intended to be a Super Famicom game, and then I guess development was lagging a little bit, so then they just translated their work to the PlayStation in Japan, and ultimately we got this game in the US as well. In Japan, this game is known as Coolie Skunk, so I don't know if Punky was a effective way to sell the game here instead of Coolie, but regardless, it's a skunk. They're not that lovable, so maybe not the best mascot character to use. I like this game, though. I think it's, again, you know, it's got its quirks. It's easy to play, and, you know, it's a decent platformer. Just don't expect too much from your PlayStation. It's not pushing it by any means, but it looks nice. Next is one of probably the more popular Jaleco releases because they used a somewhat popular in the US character of Speed Racer. I do think that prior generations would know Speed Racer a little bit better than probably the teenage market that was coming up with the PlayStation when this game released. This one is kind of a crude racing game. Again, I think it was a little bit victim of it being a very early PS1 release in Japan, and then taking 2 or 3 years after that to get released here. I also don't really know what happened with the back of the artwork, because one of the screenshots on here is in black and white, so maybe an error, but I'm sure they're all like that because, they wouldn't have taken the time to fix that. I do see this game reasonably often, so I would say this one sold pretty well for them. It does have some nice cutscenes from the Speed Racer cartoon in it, and I think if you're a big fan of Speed Racer, you would like it, but if you're looking for a quality racing game, obviously there's many other good ones to choose from the PS1. Alright, next I'm going to show you Jaleco's easily biggest hit for the PS1. Jaleco, did pretty well in the early days of gaming. I think they had a good foothold in the NES and Super Nintendo markets, but you could tell they were starting to fall off in the 32-bit generation. They struck gold with this one, though, however. This is Tetris Plus, and they did not develop this game either. This was developed by Natsume, but for some reason Natsume USA did not publish this game, and Jaleco got their hands on it, and they did really well with it. This game might have kept them afloat for a few extra years in the United States, because this was a pretty early PS1 game. What I can tell you about this one, though, is this is the sole game that you're going to look at in this video that became a greatest hit. And there were even multiple printings of this as a greatest hit. I remember seeing this game everywhere, just because people knew Tetris so well. It really was an easy game for them to sell, even though it had a very Japanese presentation to it, and was originally an arcade game, I believe, on Sega Saturn-style hardware in the arcades. So overall, this game did very well. One of the greatest hits version is kind of notable because it has, obviously, the green greatest hits artwork on it, but the Tetris Plus logo is actually done in gold foil, so it almost looks like a Working Designs title. It's pretty fancy. I may actually try to get that one eventually, just because I think it's kind of unique that it stands out. I don't really know why they even bothered to add the gold foil, because this game sold itself. Like I said, millions of people knew Tetris, and this was the only Tetris game that we got for the US, or in the US during this period, so sold very well. Next is another one that I have a soft spot for. This is Tokyo Highway Battle, also known as the entry to the Tokyo Extreme Racer series that we got in the US. This game series started, I believe, on the Super Famicom, so it wasn't the first overall, but it was the first one we got here. And if you're unfamiliar with the series, these are late-night Tokyo highway battles that you do one-on-one racing through the highways at crazy speeds and things like that. There's very little traffic, so it's easy to weave your way through in all these Japanese sports cars of the day. Really fun series. This one obviously isn't the best of them now just because it's so dated, but I really have always liked the series, and I've played them up through generations much beyond this. The very last one we got in the US is on the Xbox 360, but I think some of the more popular ones were on the Dreamcast as well as PS2. This was also a Genki release title in Japan, so Jaleco again just published it here, and I actually do kind of like the artwork. It did stand out on the shelf, especially as an earlier PS1 title, so I think they did a nice job with this one. Next is a survival horror style game, and it's also a licensed Japanese property. So we have Vampire Hunter D. I'm not familiar with the anime, I've never watched it, but I do know that that's kind of the origins of this. Again, I think this game just took too long to come out in the US, because by the time it released here in the year 2000, some of the Resident Evil games and things like that had just really moved well beyond this graphically. But however, I think it's good fan service. If you are a Vampire Hunter D fan, I'm sure you would really like this game. I think this has started to jump up in price a little bit over the last year or two, just because, again, I don't think there's a whole lot of these out there. And as a niche title, I can see why it would have its fans. Next is one that finally is getting the respect that I've always thought this was due in the marketplace. This is an incredibly rare game for the PS1 called Vanark, and I've always really liked this game. This was, again, not developed by Jaleco. It was developed by a publisher called Asmik Ace, or just Asmik, that dates back to the NES and Game Boy days. And Asmik, had a nice foothold for a while, and then just kind of went and disappeared also. This game was known as, had a longer title with Vanark included in it in Japan. I can't remember the full title, but it is essentially Star Fox for PS1. I think that would be the best way to describe this game. I'm not a huge Star Fox fan, but I found myself playing this game for at least a few levels and enjoying it. So maybe just the more adult theme and things like that are appealing. I've noticed this one is really starting to shoot up in price, and frankly, I think it should. I just don't think there's a whole lot of these that they sold. This game was hard to find even when it released in, I believe, the year 2000. So people had kind of moved on to the Dreamcast and getting excited about PS2, and I think it just got lost in the shuffle of all the releases that year. So that is essentially the full set of the US releases. The only one I'm not going to show you is a game called Super Bubble Pop. Again, not developed by Jaleco. It was developed by a UK designer, and essentially it came after the real Jaleco was broken up into some different companies, and one of those became a new Jaleco USA that really had no relation to all the games that I showed you prior. So frankly, I'm not interested in that game. It's just very ugly, and it also has a different Jaleco branding on it, so I don't really consider it part of the proper set, but it is out there again if you really want that. One more I will show you, though, just as a bonus, is one of the Japanese exclusives, which is a Jaleco Collection Volume 1. And when I said that Jaleco was broken up into some separate companies, this is actually the real Jaleco, and what they became is a company called PCCW Japan. Again, this company is also defunct now as of the mid-2000s, but they did release some games on the PS2 that are essentially what the original Jaleco became. So what is Jaleco Collection Volume 1, and where's the other volumes? So spoiler alert, there are no other volumes. This is where the series died. But this is a pretty neat collection of all the Famicom releases for, or several Famicom releases for the PS1. Many of the games on this originated as arcade games, and it would have been nice if they would have brought the arcade releases to the PS1, but instead they just brought 7 Famicom versions, emulated versions to the PS1. It does have some interesting titles. You have a few that we got here in the United States, like Formation Z, as well as City Connection, but it also has some things like Argus and Ninja Jaja Maru-kun, as Exiron, things like that we never got in the US. Primarily the one that I like the most on here is a game called Rodland. It is a single-screen platformer, which I really like that style of game, and it is a very expensive game to get on Famicom as well as European NES. We never got that game in the US, and I think it's really good. What's interesting about Rodland also is it is a Jaleco arcade game developed in Japan. However, it was European developed for the NES version, and even with that said, even the Famicom version is that European developed. So it's kind of interesting to see a Japanese-endorsed European developed a version of one of their arcade titles on this. So really, this is a good way to get Rodland. Overall, much cheaper than buying the official cartridge. But overall, this collection probably could have been a little bit more exciting than what it really is. It would have been interesting to see what would have come in the follow-up collections, but they were all canceled or, never even got off the ground floor. So that's kind of the tale of Jaleco as a whole as far as it relates to the PS1. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Give you a little bit of insight to the developer and publisher, I guess is a better way to put it, as far as some of these releases. Also want to call out their very funky logo there with the little wavy lines in the circle. That's common on all these games also. So like I said, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, I will probably try to make some more of these and do some more publisher spotlights on the PS1. Thank you very much for watching. Please take a moment, like, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think, and I will talk to you soon. Have a great day or night, wherever you are.